Welcome to Current Affairs. My name is Nathan Robinson. I'm the editor-in-chief of Current Affairs magazine. I am joined today by the award-winning author, broadcaster, professor of sociology, Gary Younge. He is a professor currently at the University of Manchester. He served for several decades as a columnist at The Guardian. His new book, Dispatches from the Diaspora, from Nelson Mandela to Black Lives Matter, collects his reporting and essays from a 30-year period. His writing has been called by The Root chilling, urgent, and profound, which it definitely is. Dispatches from the Diaspora is available from Or Books. Gary Younge, thank you so much for joining us on Current Affairs today.
Thanks for having me, Nathan.
So your book covers, because it collects your reporting from a long period of time that you served at The Guardian, it covers many, many different topics. You know, you talk to everyone from Maya Angelou to Angela Davis, Nelson Mandela. You know, you've visited Chicago and New Orleans and Barbados. And so I thought where we could maybe start in organizing this conversation is, you know, in compiling this book, you had to look back over what you had written during this period, and you had to sort of figure out what the themes were and organize your own writing. So as you looked back on your body of work, what are some of the themes that have come out of it over the years?
Well, I guess there are two main ones. The first is love in a range of ways. And I mean it in the broadest possible sense. But if you look at Mandela, Obama on election night, the Mandela in 2008, the first Mandela election moments in Britain after the Macpherson report, which the equivalent would be something like the Kerner report in the US after the uprisings in the 60s that really changed the game. Desmond Tutu, conversations with Stormzy, all of that, there is a joy, there is a kind of an energy, which I could just as easily describe it as joy, as love, but that there is a real hopefulness, a joyfulness, a kind of potential, a real sense of possibility. And then the other thing would be resistance, which comes with that sense of joy, because not all of these moments pan out.
No.
You know, and even when they don't pan out, you're not where you were, but that covering the trials of Edgar A. Killen and the other kind of the old trials from the deep south of racist murders, or if you look at how, when I go back to South Africa after 5 years of Mandela, or an assessment of at the end of Obama's 8 years, that there is this kind of there is a sense of resistance runs through it, and I would say that those would be two dominant themes. And in that way, I hope I shift. People always kind of want to know: is it getting better, or is it getting worse? And my feeling is always it's getting different. And in some ways, it's better, and in some ways, it's worse. And better and worse aren't particularly helpful kind of axis. Really, it's more like a sea than a plane. Goes up, it goes down, it's choppy, it's fluid. So, yeah, love and resistance.
That's interesting because, you know, as a reporter, it is part of your job to bear witness to and document human suffering, which, you know, you have done in a lot of your work. Obviously, you wrote a book where you went back and traced the lives of 10 people who've been killed by gun violence in the United States in a single day. And, you know, a lot of the places that you report on in this book, like Ferguson, like New Orleans after Katrina, are places that can, moments that can feel very, very bleak and hopeless. But you're right. Throughout the book, you find these incredible moments of collective joy, from Carnival in London. Well, let's go back to where you open the book, which is one of your early pieces of reporting on the moment that Nelson Mandela came to power in South Africa. What was that like?
I mean, it was incredible. And I have to paint it back in a way. I'm a 54-year-old man now, but then I was 24 when I was in South Africa. I used to picket the South African embassy with my mum. I was an activist in the anti-apartheid movement and sent to South Africa because The Guardian is a truly liberal establishment in more ways than one. it was liberal enough to understand that they needed black reporters there, but it was also liberal in a sense that it hadn't actually employed the black reporters that it wanted to send. Like, it was liberal, but it wasn't anti-racist, kind of proactive.
Yeah.
And so they looked around for somebody young, black, and cheap to go to South Africa, and I was the youngest, blackest, cheapest thing there was. So I go. Well, first of all, just the phenomenon of being in these townships that are set apart. Apartheid has set them apart. They've stuck them out in the middle of nowhere. South Africa's a very big place. They'll be in some sort of dust bowl somewhere. And Mandela's coming to give a speech because these people they didn't care about are suddenly several thousand voters in a township. And in the stadium, it's hot, Mandela's late, and then you see the cavalcade kicking up dust miles in the distance, and the people go nuts. They're dancing, they're ululating, they're singing, old women with no teeth, children with no shoes, dancing, and the energy is amazing. They've never seen, a lot of them haven't got televisions, they've never seen Mandela apart from on a poster, and as the dust gets closer, as that dust ball, as the cavalcade gets closer, they're shouting and they're singing and the rejoicing kind of increases. I'm 24, 25, and I'm in the middle of it and just thinking, how did this happen? I'm kind of overwhelmed, really. And during a curious thing happened while doing that reporting, which was, for reasons that I could go into, but kind of maybe we don't have time, I end up completely by accident hanging out with his bodyguards for a big chunk of the campaign. And so I stumble into a front row seat. You know, they take me to kind of, when they go to case the joints, just to kind of have me around, I amuse them. So I'm kind of, I stay in the same hotels that they're in, which is also the hotel that he's in. And I have this quite up close view of the whole thing. So it was stunning.
Mm-hmm. As I was reading the dispatches in this book, a number of them, seem to take events that some of us may think we know about, having seen them reported on the news, and get up close and talk to people and hear the voices that we haven't necessarily heard. I'm thinking of the Carnival piece about the origins and transformation and growth of Carnival in London. And, you talk to all these people, the steel band players from the early days, and you get a totally different sense of the event that, some of us might just read about or see pictures of. You're incredible at kind of bringing this thing alive.
Well, that's what, in a sense, I try to do is do the kind of, not populist, but popular version, the kind of, how is this thing being experienced? What is this to kind of people on the ground, which works, can work in a few ways. One of the pieces that didn't make it in because it was too long, but was a year after Katrina in New Orleans, I did a big piece about the jazz players of New Orleans and used the jazz players who had been dispersed throughout the region and who were kind of struggling in a range of ways to look at the impact of Katrina on the city and the cultural form with which the city is most kind of tightly associated. But the piece actually in my career that I'm most proud of, the piece that really I'm most proud of in my career is the interview with Claudette Colvin.
Yeah.
And that tells the story of a young woman who's kicked off the bus before Rosa Parks, and she's the one that they're going to go with. But she's very dark-skinned, she's on the wrong side of town, and then she gets pregnant, and they drop her. And any decent civil rights book that I was reading a lot of at the time would mention her name, but then that's it. And I started wondering, who is this person? It took me 2 years to find her. And then she was working as a nurse's aide in the Bronx. And then to go and interview her and to use that encounter as a way to understand, first of all, the nature of the civil rights movement, which was brilliant in a range of ways, but which was male-led, socially conservative, church-led, but also to kind of deconstruct the way that Rosa Parks is handled. And this was, prior to Jean Thea Harris's book, the way that she is misunderstood, the way that kind of history is often misunderstood as kind of individuals doing certain things. And I generally tried to think, well, what can I add to whatever it is that I'm supposed to be doing? And that was even in real time. So on election night in 2008, I just thought there's no point in me going to Grant Park because everyone will be in Grant Park to see the Obamas, and I won't have anything to add to that. And that's a media opportunity. So I'll go to a bar on the South Side and I will watch results come in with African Americans on the South Side in that. And I'll do that because then maybe I can add something to it about the way that this thing is experienced.
And whether that moment in that bar is recorded by history depends on the choice of whether a journalist like yourself is going to go there or not. And if you don't, then these moments slip away and they go unrecorded, right?
Yeah. And there are these there's a moment from that night that I think I put in the piece 8 years later when Obama is stepping down, where he wins and a woman in the bar says, "My man is in Afghanistan, he's coming home." And I thought, no, he's not. No, Obama said that that's the war that he supports, actually. And you see, like, the degree to which he looked so good, people weren't listening to what he was saying, and that there were these hopes, these delusions about what he was going to do, which you can't exactly blame him for that. If he said, "I'm going to carry on with the war in Afghanistan,"
right,
and someone hears that and thinks that their partner who's in Afghanistan is going to come home because he's won, then not that we're really talking about faults at all. But that's one thing you can't pin on Obama, really.
Yeah, it's true. He had always spoken as a moderate. He had always had a fairly centrist platform, but people invested all of their hopes and dreams in this man.
Yeah, well, and he let them, is the truth. I mean, he kind of...
yeah, he did encourage that.
Yeah, I mean, there's an amazing moment when he wins in Iowa, and he says, "They said this day would never come." He's not talking about Iowa. Nobody ever thought this day is about an African-American winning this. And yet, I used to call him the incognito because he had this way of kind of like being black without doing black, if you see what I mean. He would stand up and you could see that's what he was. And so therefore, he didn't see any need to evoke that beyond what was absolutely necessary.
As you look back on that moment in Chicago in 2008, I mean, I don't know how it feels to you in retrospect, but it strikes me as a kind of strange mixture of beautiful and tragic. Beautiful in that there is this collective ecstasy that something has been shattered, something really has transformed, and then kind of tragic in that it's the high watermark and that everything after that is sort of destined to come as a disappointment. And of course, it ultimately ends in the presidency of Donald Trump.
Well, yeah. I mean, there's the element of what it replaces, right? So it's replacing 8 years of George Bush, which was a kind of incredible accelerated degeneration in American politics. It stops Sarah Palin from becoming vice president and John McCain from becoming president. And to that extent, it is a real rupture. And then so much of we often forget that it's in the middle of an economic crisis, or the economic crisis, that the election campaign in 2008 takes place as capitalism is absolutely falling to pieces. With Bush just a few months earlier getting down on one knee. Or no, it wasn't Bush, it was his Secretary of the Treasury, Paulson maybe. But Bush says this sucker could go down. He's talking about the whole system. Paulson gets down on one knee and begs Nancy Pelosi to kind of save the bailout package. And there were so many opportunities in that moment that aren't taken. To be fair, Obama never stood saying that he was a radical. I mean, he did stand with all the tropes of the civil rights movement and the yes, we can and all that kind of stuff. So he definitely employed those kind of means and methods. But when it came to his program, as you point out, 90% of it was pretty much the same as Hillary Clinton's program. It wasn't that different. In an economic crisis, the Democrats' aim is not to save working class Americans, but to save the system.
Mm-hmm. It strikes me also that your reporting that oftentimes you are taking things that we think we know and making them more complex. Just to go back to the Colvin piece, you quote from E.H. Carr, who says, "Facts speak only when the historian calls on them as he who decides which facts to give the floor and in what order or context." And it really is the case that when you excavate this story of Colvin, you realize that, she's, a lot of people that we admire and a struggle that we think was necessary and good was actually complex, and that even people we admire can also have made a decision that in retrospect looks a little unwell. You could defend it or you could not defend it, the decision to ditch her for a candidate for, Rosa Parks. Martin Luther King openly says, well, it's great that it happened to this woman who's so, who has so much integrity, who is so, is so unimpeachable. And those words sound neutral until you hear the story of Claudette Colvin and you realize that implicitly that's kind of saying, well, this woman who wasn't as presentable on television is going to be just completely forgotten. And she had a very, very tough life after this.
Yeah. Well, I think, that story is an illustration of, there are some things that we can say, well, it's not complicated. Civil rights, the fight for civil rights, supporting it or not supporting it, that's not complicated. Right. But understanding the nature of that fight and why some people may have been left behind and left out, that is complicated. And when we look at the gendered nature of it and the class nature of it, it does help us understand kind of, where America is at the moment, who kind of, who reaped the benefits and who didn't. I mean, in a different way, there's another essay in the book, In Defense of Uncle Tom, which also tries to do that.
Yes, I was going to bring that up.
Which is kind of, I wrote it in the 150th anniversary, I think, of the publication. And it's an essay in defense of Uncle Tom, the character, who, as opposed to trying to rescue him from Uncle Tom the slur. And that if you read the book, in my mind, Uncle Tom is a hero. He dies because he's beaten to death because he refuses to say where the slaves have run. He sees another slave struggling and says, look, don't worry, I will pick this for you. He's not a revolutionary. He refuses to run with them, but he also refuses to tell the master where they've run to, and will kind of go to his deathbed rather than tell him. I think most people who use Uncle Tom the slur haven't read the book, and so this was I don't like the slur because I think it is essentializing, de-blacking. It's a way of saying you are not black enough, which I think you should criticize people for what they do, not what they are. But in any case, if you read the book, he's a poor candidate for that slur, actually.
Yeah, I wanted to bring up that example of another instance in which you take something that we think we know, Uncle Tom's Cabin. The Uncle Tom figure, obviously, as you say, has become a slur, and the book has developed now a good kind of reputation as dated and paternalistic, but you go back and explain a bit of why the book at the time was so revolutionary, why it was Lenin's favorite book, which I didn't know.
I mean, it's a deeply problematic book. It's not like...
Right. Yes.
I think I say in the piece, like, Uncle Tom has to be rescued both from Harriet Stowe and from the people who use him as a slur. I mean, it's a deeply problematic book. I think any book that is about is about the South and has black characters at its center from the mid-19th century, which was written by a white woman, is probably going to be problematic. So we kind of, we have to roll with that
one. Yes, that's true. So there was another example of you making something I knew more complicated, which was you have a piece on Robert Mugabe, who late in life developed just a reputation as just an autocrat. But you go back into the history of Mugabe, and in his life, he was considered, you could have said his name in the same breath as Nelson Mandela.
Oh, yeah. And people did. He was the hope. He was the hope of the continent. And he, certainly in a kind of latter-day Nkrumah kind of figure, Kwame Nkrumah was the post-colonial leader of Ghana, that Mugabe was this incredibly bright, kind of very determined, had been quite principled, and not that there aren't a range of things that kind of go horribly, wrong, particularly in Matabeleland in the kind of the early to mid-'80s. And that war against the white regime, also there is a kind of civil war. Bob Marley sings a song about him. He is, he's the man. And Mandela's still in jail. This is a man who led the country to freedom and who insisted on a form of democracy, not a form of some weird, insisted on a democracy and actually kind of, managed to get a kind of reasonably healthy democratic and economic system going, applying his principles in terms of wherever he can, in terms of Marxism and socialism, and it degrades. He's there too long. You see this quite a lot with new countries, and, he can't let go of the leadership. He'd rather kill the thing he loves and sets it free, and then he sets about doing that, which is depressing and distressing. It felt to me, when I went to do that piece, that it was important to kind of understand the trajectory, which is different to letting him in any way off the hook. This was the degradation of something that had been impressive.
Yeah, I mean, it's only letting him off the hook if you think we have to subscribe to one simple narrative or the other and sort of can't handle the full set of complicated facts.
Yeah.
Another example of where you go kind of unexpected places is your widely read piece on why we should tear down all of the statues, which is one of my favorites of yours, because you go in and I don't think anyone else had put forth that perspective on what ought to be done.
Well, one of the kind of funny things with that piece was seeing it play out on Twitter, where the trolls would say, "Oh, right, so you're going to take down the statue of Mandela then?" And it's like, just read the fucking piece.
Read the piece.
Read the fucking piece. That's exactly what I say. It wouldn't be the first statue I'd take down, but yeah, that kind of, obviously, clearly a lot of these statues are offensive, but there is also a deep ambivalence towards them. They are very poor ways to remember people, even the ones that you like. They individualize history. So Montgomery has a statue of Rosa Parks, a few statues of Rosa Parks, but Rosa Parks, she didn't do it on her own, right? There was a 13-month boycott. So it individualizes historical moments. It elevates. They're not history. They are kind of celebrations of individuals. They are elevated beyond the kind of the immediate. They kind of seek to represent a closure where often there is no closure. Like I say, there are better ways to remember people. It is noteworthy that one of North Korea's biggest exports are statues compared to kind of other dictatorship. And that while there are some that I object to on ideological grounds and others who ideologically I agree with, actually the ones that I agree with, I don't need them there in order to remind me that Nelson Mandela was a great person or that Martin Luther King was a great person. I don't need a statue for that. In a range of ways, what happens when you put them up there is that you put them beyond history. You put them as kind of artifacts. And finally, they are very poor. Generally speaking, they are very poor as works of art. So rather than getting into, which we were in Britain, like, well, how many of this person does it make to get rid of a Churchill? Do you know what I mean? What happens if we get rid of Churchill? And all of the kind of angst around that, just thinking, well, just, let's take them all down. And then if you want to remember Churchill, find a way to remember Churchill that doesn't kind of take up so much space.
You say that, you've heard that we should even the score by erecting statues of prominent black, abolitionist, female, and other figures who are underrepresented, and you understand the motivations, but you don't agree with it. The problem isn't that we have too few statues, but it's too many. It's a good thing that many of the statues of pillagers, plunderers, bigots, and thieves have been taken down because they're offensive. But you think all statues should be taken down, and yes, Columbus, Leopold II, Colston and Rhodes, but also Mandela, Gandhi, Seacole, and Tubman too. But you say, of course I want Rosa Parks to be remembered. Of course I want her to take her rightful place in history. All the less reason to diminish that memory by casting her in bronze and erecting her beyond memory. It is true that these statues, they never capture the likeness of a person. They're very kind of eerie in a certain way. The Martin Luther King statue in D.C. is kind of horrible.
Yeah. No, they're spooky. They're not accurate as a likeness, and they're not, generally speaking, they're not pretty. Every now and then I've seen some where I thought, oh, that actually is that is a great piece of architecture. It's very, very rare. Because there has been this push in Britain and elsewhere, I think, to say, yes, there are all these terribly racist statues. I know more statues of women and black people and so on. It's like, first of all, that's too many bloody statues. But secondly, you're almost saying in that point that, like, you're making an equivalence between someone who murdered lots of people in a colonial war and someone who freed their country from colonialism. Well, no, they're not equal. Certainly not morally, but I would say not politically. So,
And one of the points that you make in the essays, you were on like a statue commission to think about who would go on the fourth plinth in Trafalgar Square somewhere. And you said people would make suggestions to you and you'd say, well, who's on the other three? And no one would remember. And so you point out that we don't even notice who the people who are made into statues. We think it's a way to remember people, but actually it's almost a way to forget them. Oh, it's just another stone head.
Yeah, well, exactly. I mean, I did that piece got a lot of attention, and I was invited to the Royal College of Fine Arts in Copenhagen to do a talk because they had an issue with a statue or a bust of one of the Danish kings who oversaw slavery. I think it was a Frederick. Might be wrong, but who oversaw Denmark's colonial efforts. Denmark was a colonizer of the US Virgin Islands for quite some time and a few other places. And there had been, actually as part of a lesson, one of the lecturers had, along with the students, organized to take this bust and throw it in the river. And when the right wing had found out, they'd been outraged and all sorts of things had happened. There'd been criminal trials. What was indicative of this thing was that it was actually quite a few weeks before anybody noticed that it was missing. And that tells you something about, about the kind of, the use and the usefulness of these artifacts.
I've been dwelling on the statue thing in part because I think it does capture something that really runs through all of your work in this book, which seems to me to be, as I mentioned earlier, kind of getting up close to human beings and showing them in their complexity, showing the flesh and blood people behind, taking apart the simple stories and going and seeing the people who are often more complicated and interesting and messy than you realize. And just to let our listeners know, you have, up close encounters with Maya Angelou, Angela Davis, Lewis Hamilton in this, and they're all really, really interesting people, and you don't know how interesting they are until you get close.
Yeah, no, I have been very blessed in my career. I'm not dead yet. In terms of the people I've got to speak to, and there have been the people on the ground in that bar in South Side of Chicago, or Claudette, or people in New Orleans after Katrina and so on. I had Desmond Tutu basically fall asleep on me at one point, which was kind of quite funny. We've been talking about his schedule being just too much for him, and while we were talking about that, he just starts kind of keeling over, and I don't have the heart to wake him up. His publisher kind of prods him. Talking politics on Stormzy's couch. I know Stormzy isn't quite the presence in America that he is in Britain, but lest there be any confusion, Stormzy was a big supporter of Jeremy Corbyn in Britain. He headlines at Glastonbury, funds scholarships to Cambridge. I mean, he's quite a brilliant young man, and he's just 30 now. I think when I spoke to him, he was 27. He talks about mental health challenges. He's a brilliant young man. And sort of to his credit as a British person, he's known in America, but he's not desperate to be known in America. He's like, well, if they get to know me, they get to know me. So talking politics to Stormzy on his couch, Maya Angelou, I was supposed to have 45 minutes with her. 13 hours later, I roll out of her stretch limo, quite pissed. I mean, drunk, not angry.
Yeah, you got to clarify that for Americans.
Because we got stuck in an LA traffic jam, and the whiskey came out in the limo. Her assistant, Miss Stuckey, she says, would you like some whiskey, Mr. Young? And I say, yes, please. And then Miss Stuckey says, would you like ice and stuff, Miss Angelou, Dr. Angelou? And she says, I want a little bit of ice and a lot of stuff. And so these big whiskeys come out, and it's a big LA traffic jam, and it will just kind of keep going. And honestly, I staggered out of the car probably about 45 minutes, an hour after the whiskey started flowing, just thinking, I could die tomorrow. I'll be a happy man. I got drunk with Maya Angelou in her car. I've had a fantastic day. So, yeah, there've been, Angela Davis, talking to her at the beginning. Obama is just coming through, and Angela Davis is talking about the model of diversity that is being understood in this moment. And she describes it as the difference that makes no difference and the change that brings no change. I'm not talking specifically about Obama, but the way that he's understood. Mm. And John Carlos, good gracious me, John Carlos.
Oh, right, of course, yes.
One of the Olympian who raises his fist in the 68 Olympics in Mexico, who says, I mean, so memorable. In life, there's the beginning and the end. The beginning don't matter and the end don't matter. All that matters is what you do in between, whether you're prepared to do what it takes to make change. There has to be physical and material sacrifice. When all the death settles and we're getting ready to play down for the 9th inning, the greatest reward is to know that you did your job when you were here on the planet. Just such a powerful testimony. And when I speak to him, he's a kind of school counselor in Southern California, in Palm Springs. And, when I asked for him at the desk, they're like, yeah, he's kind of through there, and you go past the basketball courts, and then he's got this outsized place in history, and then he's got this kind of little office where he talks to kind of, kids who are displaying challenging behavior. It was quite a trip.
Yeah. No, as I say, you really excavate the human reality here. Maya Angelou is this kind of mythical, angelic figure, and you get down to like having whiskey with her in the limo. And I think the result here, if we could just sort of conclude by what you've put together in this book, it ends up seeming to me like just this, this kind of rich panorama of little snapshots of the African diaspora around the world, from the Caribbean to Africa to the United States to Europe. And as you mentioned at the beginning, there's this mixture of, you don't shy away from, showing the depths of racism in both Europe and the United States, but also this joy, this humanity, this resistance, and this incredible diversity within the diaspora.
Yeah, I was prompted to put this collection together because I had recently left journalism as a full-time profession, having been at The Guardian for several years, although some of these pieces in the collection are from The Nation or GQ or New York Review of Books, but most of them are from The Guardian. But also, it became clear to me, one way of saying this would be, it became clear to me that I was old. But another way would be that if you were 25, well, then Nelson Mandela was kind of never in jail. You were born more or less the year that he resigned. He's the ex-leader of a kind of faraway country. If you're 25, then 9/11 is not really even a memory for you. And so in the middle of the kind of Black Lives Matter protest, this sense that like there could be some value in putting all this stuff together in one place that would suggest a kind of, not a continuous thread, but a continuum of struggle, of resistance, of joy, of engagement, that we haven't been here before, because we've never been here before. You never cross the same river twice, because you're different and the river's different. But we have had a range of challenges for a long time. Nobody comes out of them unscathed. They are never uncomplicated. They're always much more complicated than they seem, and they're always different close-up than the version that is presented to you from a distance, both historically, geographically, and in terms of power. And the hope is that the collection provides some sense of a continuum in the litany of Black life and death.
Well, just to close, I'd like to just read the final paragraph from your final Guardian column after your 3 decades of reporting, which is a beautiful mixture of realism and hopefulness. You say, I sign off from this column at a dispiriting time, with racism, cynicism, and intolerance on the rise, wages stagnant, and faith that progressive change is possible declining, even as resistance grows. Things look bleak. The propensity to despair is strong, but should not be indulged. Sing yourself up. Imagine a world in which you might thrive, for which there is no evidence, and then fight for it. That's what I love about your work, Gary Younge. You never let us lose faith. The book is Dispatches from the Diaspora, from Nelson Mandela to Black Lives Matter, available from Or Books. Gary Younge, thank you so much for joining us on Current Affairs today.
Thank you.
The Current Affairs Podcast is a product of Current Affairs Magazine. If you are not subscribed to Current Affairs Magazine, visit currentaffairs.org/subscribe today and get our glorious print edition. The Current Affairs Podcast is released regularly every week on patreon.com/currentaffairs. Thanks for listening.